Nobody talks about the good girl. The good girl who was expected to get good grades in school, to not cause too much trouble at home, the girl who was expected to not say too much, to not color outside of the lines, and to actually go on to be the most successful. That girl. The girl who was burdened with responsibility at an early age, either being the first girl or the second born. And oftentimes, while that responsibility may have been assigned to her, eventually it became an identity. And even so, in some cases, a cage. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Pretty Suited Podcast, where we discuss real topics through the lens of some of the most iconic figures in our culture. I'm your host, Lauren A. Good to see you guys this week. I decided to take a little bit of a break. Work and everything has been going so crazy, so I just wanted to take some time, focus on a little bit of things, straighten some things out, do some laundry, get my life together. Because between school as well as my creative things, it was just becoming a lot. So I actually have decided to make this podcast a bi-weekly. I think that's the best option at this time, given everything that's going on in my personal life. I'm knocking out some goals. I'm knocking out some professional things. I'm paying off, my student loans, all the things going on. So I just want to make sure that I am putting my best foot forward and putting out some good content for you guys. And I do have a lot more to come, more interviews, more conversations, extending the conversations to other public figures outside of TV as well as movies. So yeah, I'm super excited about what's going on. So moving it to bi-weekly will allow me that space to be able to do that. So anyways, I'm excited to talk about this week because, personally, me and my friends were talking and a good conversation just so happened to come up last weekend. And we were talking about how nobody really talks about the good girl. Right? There's so much going on in the media today where people who are more assertive, people who are more boisterous, who are less conservative are the biggest influencers out there, seems like at the moment. But nobody really talks about the good girl. And growing up, we had a lot of different role models that kind of showcase the good girl, or just even different kind of girls, right? The different archetypes of the girl. We had the bad girls, we had good girls portrayed, we had the nerds, we had the emos, we had the corporate girls. Like in TV and film, we always had different women portrayed, and you actually found yourself in these different characters just because they were so different and they were very relatable. Versus nowadays, I feel like you don't really see those different archetypes. I feel like a lot of the TV shows and movies and public figures out there, they tend to have the same look, the same attitude, and the same way that they carry themselves out in public. And a lot of that is led with sexuality. And so, which is not a bad thing. I feel like women over the years deserve to be able to showcase themselves in any way that they want to, because we're flesh. We have desires, we have goals and opportunities and a mind, and we're not just a monolith. But I really want to hearken on a particular role model that I grew up with. When we talk about the good girls, a good example of the evolution of that good girl is none other than Laura Winslow from Family Matters. The good girl who was expected to get good grades in school, to not cause too much trouble at home, the girl who was expected to not say too much, to not color outside of the lines, and to actually go on to be the most successful. The girl who was burdened with responsibility at an early age, either being the first girl or the second born. And oftentimes, while that responsibility may have been assigned to her, eventually it became an identity. And even so, in some cases, a cage. Family Matters debuted back in 1989. It starred Jo Marie Payton as Harriet Winslow, Reginald Vale Johnson as Carl Winslow, Darius McCrary as Eddie Winslow, Jaleel White as Steve Urkel, and Kelly Williams as Laura Winslow. So with it being the late 80s, early 90s, there was a huge push on the family moral, right? The moral family. What does the core nuclear family look like? How do they interact with each other? How do they interact outside of, the home? And kind of just coming from the drug eras of the 80s, it was a real agenda to be able to hone in on the nuclear family and make it a common thing, make it a ideal family goal. And Family Matters was one of several different kind of shows that showcased that. Again, this was a spinoff of another show, and so being able to showcase a Black family in this light in the South Side of Chicago, you were able to see a different aspect of nuclear family. And so Carl Winslow was, of course, a police officer, while Harriet Winslow, the wife, was never quite a stay-at-home mom. She did work, however, she definitely was a homemaker, being kind of the sole matriarch of the family. Now, Eddie, for some reason, like many shows back in the day, they always had a gullible character, a character who was like seriously dumb. And they had Eddie start off as just not having it. I mean, there's one thing to be an adolescent boy who might just be a little, off, but they really made him a little dumb in the beginning. So Laura was that stark contrast to Eddie Winslow. And so it allowed her to shine as the smart one, the one who got good grades in school, the one who, never got in trouble with the principal or the teacher, while Eddie, on the other hand, did not do so well in school, got in trouble a lot with the principal, skipping school, all the things that adolescent boys should be doing. And so you saw that stark difference. And then you also saw Laura Winslow take on the kind of almost maternal role to her younger sister Judy, as well as little Richie, while the mother was away and the father was at work, and so on and so forth. So she kind of had that burden of being a second mom. And I want to start the conversation off with that. I feel like a lot of times that firstborn daughter, I feel like they are unfortunately given the title of a second mom to the other siblings because of the developing need of the mom to be outside of the home.
Lo, what's 8 times 9? 72. No, what's 81?
And while essentially you may not think it to be a bad thing because you just feel like you're giving an opportunity to be a big girl or to be, not a kid anymore, over time, that responsibility ends up weighing on you because you feel that pressure to always have that responsibility tied to you. And I feel like in Laura's case, while she was, a good student and while she strived to do well in class, she ended up bearing on the identity of being the responsible one at an early age. She may have gotten some slack about it throughout the years, whether it was from friends or she joined the cheerleading squad and always wanting to color inside the lines, always wanting to date this certain type of guy, all of the things. But essentially, that was a part of the identity of the good girl. And I think that, while she had many suitors, because let me tell you something, Laura was a very beautiful girl. She had fantastic style as the seasons went on. I would say maybe around season 3 is when you really started to see Laura's style come into play. As the show grew more popular, she started to have more of that, maybe she started to wear more makeup, have a little red lip, had some fingernail polish, as well as, just kind of like a young, hip, early 90s look, whether it was shoulder pads, whether it was, a starched collar, whether it was a cute, dainty dress. You start to see her develop. And with that development, you also start to see her interest in boys. And even in the interest in boys, it almost confused her because she felt like, yes, it was something that she wanted, but was she supposed to have it? So just the conversation around, her wanting to date was a big deal because from her brother or from her father wanting to be overprotective of the good girl, it kind of made her feel more stifled. And I can speak on that, personally. I feel like even growing up in my life, I feel like me wanting to date boys and do normal things to kind of release the responsibility of being responsible, then every man around me wanted to just exaggerate their protection over me and fear that would cloud my judgment or that would steer me in the wrong direction away from being the good girl that I was.
I cannot believe you showed up at the party and looking like that. How could you do this to me, Mom?
Do this to you? You know perfectly well you were supposed to be home by midnight.
Mom, I told you, I lost track of time. Why are you freaking out like this?
Because we have rules, Laura. And as long as you're living under my roof, you better abide by them.
And I'm not saying that that's wrong, because you don't want somebody to be distracted and their path to be misdirected just because of an impulse, or because of, they're just wanting to rebel. However, I feel that the overcompensation of their behavior, of their protection, could essentially cause somebody to go into the right direction and rebel even more. Usually when it comes to an older brother or a younger sister or vice versa, the quest to be the family favorite or the quest to be the best kid or best child usually starts off as a challenge, right? I feel like the challenge of I could do this better than you is where the origin starts. So, whether you like, hey, I got an A, you got a B, or hey, I cleaned up this and you didn't do that, or hey, mom and dad is going to yell at you for doing this and while I'm not getting yelled at. So essentially it starts off as a challenge, but over time that can become your identity. And the person who was known to, mess up all the time, that becomes even their own identity, where I'm expected to mess up. So I might as well just go ahead and do it. Or you're the mess up, so you go ahead, I'm going to be the responsible one and not cause too much mischief. And I think that, again, it starts off as innocent, but over time, I even found out while my brother may have been the one to, require extra attention from school, require extra attention from, teachers, from my parents, I wanted to be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to be out the way. I'm going to stick to my books. I'm going to stick to my grades. I'm going to stick to my group of friends. And I'm going to make sure that I don't cause extra work on my family, on my parents, because they're already going through a lot, right? Both of them are working, both of them are trying to make a living for us. And as much as I can stay out the way, the better. But what does that do internally, right? What does that do internally for the good girl or the good boy? What happens internally is that the quintessential need to stay out of the way develops into a hyper independence over time. Because I don't want to cause any more stress or strife in my parents' life, I'm going to be extremely responsible. I'm going to be extremely self-sufficient, and I'm going to do my best to make my own decisions, to make the right decisions, and to be successful so that I'm not an extra burden on my parents. And so that happens. Again, it starts off very small, very insidious, and then it grows into something where that becomes an identity. And so what happens to that adolescence now? What happens to that adult now who has developed these coping mechanisms to where now as an adult, you kind of have to unlearn those things in order for you to accept help, in order for you to release responsibility and delegate tasks and to invite people into your life. That takes some unlearning because you have been doing it the opposite way throughout your whole life, trying to be out of the way. but it's detrimental to your development and to your interpersonal relationships as an adult. And so I feel like, with Laura, in her case, she was, developing into a young girl. Men were starting to take notice of her. She was starting to date. Different kinds of men were starting to notice her, right? Because even as a good girl, you have the good guy who wants to be with you because you're a good girl and it kind of fits the narrative, right? But then you also have the bad boy. The bad boy wants to be with you as well because because it's like a contrast, right? I want to see how good she really is. I want to see if she has a bad side to her. I want to see if I can taint that bad side so that way, I can say that I changed her. And I feel like that can essentially be a target. You could essentially be a target as a good girl for the type of person who wants to see you fall. And I think that's a big deal that nobody talks about either, because, even as the one of my favorite episodes of Family Matters was the episode where Laura was about 15 years old and she started to date this boy named Daniel Wallace, right? Daniel Wallace was that guy. I can't remember his name, but he was in every last single 90s TV show as the handsome young guy. And Daniel Wallace, he found out about Laura. She was very beautiful. And he saw that she was one of the girls who has not been touched yet in school. And so he wanted to make it his mission to take her down. And so when I tell you that this story is so close to home, I feel like, a lot of times it's a conquering thing. And so Daniel wanted to be the one to say that he got Laura. And unfortunately, being green, like most good girls are initially, she fell for it, right? She felt that he was a good guy. He put on a good facade. Even her friend Max tried to tell her, hey, this is not a good guy. He even tried to get me, girl. So I don't think you want to do that. She was like, no, but you're not me. You're not me, so he doesn't want to do me like that. And of course she fell for it, and he wanted to make out with her and kind of go further in her bedroom, and she just wasn't having it. Thankfully she stopped him and kind of just chucked him to the wind, blocked him, right? The 1993 version of blocked, right? She definitely blocked him. But it took that experience for her to know that, hey, not all these guys really want to see you do well. Not all these guys mean the best for you. Some guys really see you as something to conquer. And so, she learned that lesson very early on, but she was also very heartbroken because as a good girl, you do oftentimes see the good in people, right? You want to know that, hey, everybody has good in them. And I want to be able to see the good in you. And so that way, we can work well together. But in those lessons, you find out that everybody doesn't have that same idea or concept. But one thing that is not talked about a person who is hyper independent or hyper focused on being a quote unquote good girl is that sometimes they don't really see who they are. Sometimes the facade is so big and has grown into this, three-headed monster that you don't really even see who you are and see how people see you. I think an episode that shed light on that was when Laura and Maxine was talking about them going off to school. And while, of course, Laura wanted Max to go off to school with her, and then, they may have different majors, but they're in school together and they could continue to be best friends, Maxine had decided that she really wanted to go to hair school. And initially, Laura kind of like talked about it like it wasn't a big deal. Like, why would you want to do that? Like, what do you mean? Like, that's not good enough. And that hurt Max's feelings. And it was a few episodes like that showcased Laura kind of downplaying what everybody else was doing because it wasn't quite up to her standard, and almost in a snobby way. And I think a lot of times the good girls get a bad rep for being snobby because of their standards. Let's talk about that. But I think a lot of times too, their standards are so high for themselves that they expect everybody else to have the same kind of standards. And Maxine had to tell her about herself, which she often did, right? In a few episodes, Maxine had to tell her to say, hey, look, you may want to go to school and be a lawyer. You may want to go to a fancy university, Ivy League school, all the things. But you got to understand that other people have dreams too. They're just as important for them as your dreams are to you. So who are you to say that my dreams aren't good enough for me? I actually like doing hair, and I wish you would be a better friend and be supportive of my dreams. And so I really appreciate that conversation too, because oftentimes friends do butt heads on their dreams. I want to see us do this, and this together, right? I want to see us, go to college. I want to see us get married together, have kids, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, the friends' dreams may not align as you grow older. Right? You guys develop your own interests. You guys develop your own families, your own concepts of success. And it may not align, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to not be friends anymore. That just means that it's not the same as you were when you planned your life at 5 years old. And so I really liked that episode too. And I think it was another time that Max had to check Laura, because coming from a 2-family household in the south side of Chicago, that may not have been a very regular thing. While the Winslow family was, I would assume to be a middle class family, a lot of the kids that they may have been dealing with did not have that same loving home. And so Max had to check Laura a couple times about even just how she viewed her mom. And Laura got to the point where she was just not having Harriet, her being around and her having an opinion, just like what a lot of adolescent girls do. But Max had to check her and be like, you better be glad your mother cares about where you are and what you're doing. I could come in the house at 4 a.m, and while you may be jealous of me, I'm 16 years old doing this. Like, I wish my mother would give me some boundaries and let me know that it's wrong, or actually care about where I am, instead of just letting me do me. And so I think those conversations are important to have too, because while the good girl may have her own bubble of a world where she's, doing these things and kind of have a family and a structure and things like that, she doesn't really see outside of her world and how she could come across because of what she's been so used to. Another hidden story that is Laura Winslow is how she was able to accept who she was. I feel like when you are a good girl, and I keep saying good girl because it is kind of like a goody two shoes, whatever you want to call it. When you are that character in your friend group, in your family, whatever, you end up either accepting it for what it is or you reject it. I think over time, like I was stating about how that added responsibility made you often resent your siblings or your parents for putting that pressure on you so early. You end up resenting them for that. And you oftentimes just make a complete 180 and just kind of go off and do something completely irresponsible or impulsive just so that you could feel alive. Just so that you could feel like you are able to color outside of the lines for the first time. And I think that, that is one route that you could take over time. But another route you could take is actually accepting who you are and what it is and how that is contributing to your character. I feel like once you're aware of what being that kind of character has done to you in your life, you can make adjustments. So I feel like me personally, while I always strive to have good grades, always strive to, not cause so much trouble or mischief for my parents, I feel like even going into college, I wanted to step outside of the box, but not too much. Because essentially down deep, like essentially my own personality wouldn't really quite allow me to be somebody that I'm not. And I think that even in the person that rebels and does the complete opposite, they're not doing it because that's who they are. They're doing it to prove people wrong. And I feel like, or they're doing it to, basically say a big F you to whoever put them in the box. And I feel like for me personally, I'm naturally and instinctively a cautious person, an assertive person, a person who has their own mind, a person who is a leader, a person who is creative, a person who takes the initiative, a person who's ambitious. That's who I am. But I never wanted to be somebody who I was not. That's what it all boils down to. Is, are you being who you are, or are you carrying the baggage and the luggage and the facade of who others want you to be? And I think even in Laura's story, she decided that, I have goals and I have ambition and I have dreams. And I think the biggest thing about all of this is her deciding to be with Steve Urkel. Because I feel that despite everybody's, qualms about who she should date, if she should be with Stefan, because everybody wanted Stefan. He was the cooler, nicer, better dresser, sexier version of Steve Urkel. Everybody felt like she should choose him. She had the option. He proposed and everything, right? They were together. They had a trajectory to be married. And that was who on paper she was supposed to be with. But Laura decided with her own mind that, hey, despite the look and the expectation for me to be with Stefan Urkel, I choose Steve Urkel. Why do I choose Steve Urkel? Because he is kinder. He's always respected me. He's always, had my back. He's always been in my corner. He's always, been my ride or die. He has his own brain. And I feel like, that choice within itself went against what everybody felt, what everybody expected of her. And that was a decision that she made. And I think that that's what made it even more special. So shout out to the girl, the good girl, who may have started off with the burden of responsibility due to people's, predisposed notions on them, who decided to grow up, who decided to shed that expectation and just be who they were, be who they are, without any qualms, without anybody's permission. Shout out to that girl, because ultimately we're all here to live our own lives. And it is a detriment to ourselves to live a life that is categorized into a certain thing, a certain label, a certain idea, and that we don't get to make our own decision to live our own life. So shout out to them. So now let's get into our throwback tune. So this week's throwback tune, I'm going to throw it back to around the time where Family Matters ended. Family Matters ended around 96, 97. And around that time, there was a supergirl group at the time by the name of En Vogue, who came out with the amazing, my favorite En Vogue song, Don't Let Go. Don't Let Go was one of the breakout singles from not only En Vogue's album, but from the Set It Off soundtrack. The Set It Off soundtrack debuted in 1996. And this, of course, just like most soundtracks that we talk about from the 90s, it was jumping, right? It was so many great songs on that soundtrack. But Don't Let Go stood out because everybody remembers the scene in the video where you were able to see Blair Underwood and Jada Pinkett Smith have that romantic sex scene where it was candlelight, it was wax, it was jewelry kind of being played with on her body. He was just adoring her body in that scene. And that song came on and you just felt like you needed to look away. But I fell in love with that song once I saw that scene. Like, that was just such a romantic a scene. And so that song just happened to be the group's last single with Dawn Robinson in it. Dawn Robinson, as you may know, in recent news, she just reported that she's actually making the decision to live in her car. So she's, joined people who live in their cars, people who live in like, I guess, vans or RVs or any kind of like trucker vehicles, where they just make a life of just traveling and living in their car. So, she wasn't, I don't think in that video necessarily asking for money, but she was really just kind of reporting what she's been doing. So shout out to Dawn, because that original group of En Vogue, they made the most noise. I feel like, of course, they were the most successful girl group at the time, and they just had hit after hit after hit. But Don't Let Go was such a sexy song. And the video was just as sexy. I remember them being in all black leather with, the dark lipstick and the micro braids of the 1990s and early 2000s. Let's bring back micro braids. Like, what? Used to be able to style them and everything. But anyways, that video was just very, very, very late 90s, kind of going into the millennium. Take that song from that soundtrack and throw it on your playlist. Or you could just listen to the soundtrack itself, because like I said, it's really good too. So shout out to En Vogue and Don't Let Go. So that brings us to the end of the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, you cannot manifest anything you feel like you don't deserve. So create the life that you want and look to the sky for grace. Bye-bye.